What if your name could be taken from you, not by choice, not by mistake, but by order of the state? What if overnight your identity was rewritten, your history erased, and your life reduced to a record in someone else's ledger? Before we begin, take a moment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you're drawn to stories that unfold slowly, where history speaks louder than speculation, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Because this case is not about violence in the way most stories are. It's about pressure, it's about erasure, and it's about what happens when a person becomes invisible inside a system that no longer sees them as human. This is the story of Elina Zlatanova, the last woman executed in Bulgaria. Today we are going to Eastern Europe in the late 1980s, a place that at the time was very different from what it is today. Our story takes us to the town of Kardzhali in southern Bulgaria, a region close to both the Greek and Turkish borders, and one that would soon find itself at the center of a quiet but far-reaching political campaign. The woman at the center of this case was known in official records as Elina Zlatanova. However, this was not the name she had been born with. Her original name is not known. It was replaced in the mid-1980s as part of what the Bulgarian communist authorities called the revival process, a state-led campaign that forced members of the Turkish minority to abandon their birth names and adopt Slavic ones. The policy was carried out between December 1984 and January 1985. During that period, the names of more than 300,000 people were changed by decree. The operation was met with protests across the country. Reports emerged of arrests, detentions, and the use of prison camps. Entire communities were affected, and for many, identity itself became something decided by the state. Kardzhali, where Elina lived, had a predominantly Turkish population. It was a town shaped by industry, proximity to borders, and political oversight. By the mid-1980s, it existed under growing pressure as Bulgaria's communist government attempted to enforce uniformity while the world beyond its borders was already beginning to change. It was in this environment, where names could be taken and identities rewritten, that Elina Zlatanova's story began. Before we begin, take a moment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you're drawn to stories that unfold slowly, where history speaks louder than speculation, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Because this case is not about violence in the way most stories are. It's about pressure, it's about erasure, and it's about what happens when a person becomes invisible inside a system that no longer sees them as human. This is the story of Elina Zlatanova, the last woman executed in Bulgaria. Kardzhali was a town in southern Bulgaria with a population of around 60,000 people. It sat close to both the Greek and Turkish borders, and by the 1980s had become home to one of the country's largest Turkish communities. The town's location made it strategically important, but also politically sensitive, particularly during the years of the government's assimilation campaign. Elina lived there with her husband, their 2 young sons, and her brother. The family occupied an apartment in the town, where daily life followed a rigid and largely unchanging routine. Elina worked as a midwife, a position that carried responsibility but little independence. Her husband was a physician at the local hospital, a role that placed him in a higher social standing within the community. Her father had once served as a member of parliament, and the family was considered respectable. Inside the home, however, authority was clearly defined. Elina was expected to manage the household, care for the children, and maintain her job while receiving little assistance in return. Her movements were limited. She was permitted to leave only for work or essential errands. Contact with extended family was restricted, and her daily life was largely confined to the apartment. There were no records of public conflict, no reports of disorder, but the structure of her life allowed for little autonomy. Responsibilities accumulated, while personal freedom steadily narrowed. Over time, the household became closed in on itself, marked by routine, silence, and a growing sense of isolation. By the beginning of 1986, Her world had become small, controlled, and difficult to escape. Life inside the apartment followed a fixed pattern. The space was shared by Elina, her husband, their 2 young children, and her brother. The arrangement left little room for privacy or independence. Each day unfolded in much the same way, shaped by routine and obligation rather than choice. Elina worked as a midwife, a profession that required long hours and responsibility. Despite this, the management of the household remained entirely her responsibility. Cooking, cleaning, and childcare were expected of her, alongside her professional duties. Her husband, employed as a doctor at the local hospital, did not take part in these tasks. Neither did her brother. The division of labor was clear and unchanging. Financially, she depended on the household structure that surrounded her. Socially, she remained isolated within it. Her movements outside the apartment were limited to work or necessary errands. She did not visit relatives freely, nor was she encouraged to maintain contact beyond what was required. Daily life was contained within a narrow physical and social boundary. There are no records of arguments or disturbances. There are no accounts of violence or public conflict. What emerges instead is a life defined by repetition and control, where responsibility accumulated but autonomy did not. By the start of 1986, her existence had settled into a closed routine, one with little variation, little rest, and no visible path outward. January 19, 1986, was observed in Bulgaria as Midwife's Day. It was a date recognized across the country, particularly among medical workers, and marked by small gatherings and social occasions. For those in the profession, it was a day meant to acknowledge their work. That morning, Elina prepared herself as usual. She dressed carefully and arranged her appearance before returning to the apartment. There were no plans recorded for the evening, but she remained at home, waiting. As the hours passed, she did not leave. She did not contact anyone. She remained in the apartment. Her husband did not return at the expected time. When he eventually arrived, it was late. There was no indication of acknowledgement, no mention of the day, and no explanation offered. The evening passed without conversation or recognition. Nothing further is recorded about the night. There was no argument reported, no raised voices, no outward reaction. The apartment remained quiet. Later, Elina went to bed. There was no confrontation, there was no discussion, there was no resolution. The day ended as it had begun, without incident, without acknowledgement, and without change. What remained was the continuation of the same routine, undisturbed and unspoken, as another day came to a close. The following morning began without incident. Elina woke early, as she normally did. The apartment was quiet. Her husband was preparing to leave for work. There were no raised voices and no recorded disagreement. She prepared breakfast and carried out the same routine tasks that had defined her mornings for years. Nothing about the start of the day appeared unusual. After her husband left, she remained in the apartment. The children were still inside. There were no visitors and no contact with anyone outside the home. What followed occurred within the ordinary setting of the apartment and involved items that were already present there. Because of frequent power outages in the area, the household kept a supply of diesel fuel to operate a generator when electricity failed. The fuel was stored in a container kept inside the apartment, as was common at the time. It had a practical purpose and was not unusual to have on hand. At some point during the morning, Elina took the container and began pouring the fuel throughout the apartment. No explanation was given, no note was written, no attempt was made to contact anyone. The actions were carried out quietly and without interruption. The apartment remained closed. The children were still inside. The sequence of events continued from there. The fire began inside the apartment shortly after the fuel had been poured. The flames spread quickly through the enclosed space. At the time, Elina's younger son was asleep in his crib. He did not wake. The cause of death was later recorded as smoke inhalation. Her older son, 4 years old, attempted to move away from the fire. He did not leave the apartment. He was later found to have sustained a fatal knife wound. Elina exited the apartment before the fire fully consumed it. Neighbors reported the smoke, and the fire brigade arrived within minutes. Their efforts prevented the building from being completely destroyed. Inside, both children were found deceased. Elina was taken to the local police station for questioning. During her initial statement, she told officers that an unknown man wearing a blue work uniform had entered the apartment and started the fire. The account was recorded, but inconsistencies were noted. When investigators examined the scene after the fire was extinguished, they discovered evidence that did not align with her statement. An autopsy later confirmed that the older child had been stabbed before the fire spread. Elina was questioned again. After being presented with the findings, she admitted responsibility for what had occurred. She was placed under arrest. From that point forward, the case moved out of the private sphere and into the hands of the state. At the time of the trial, capital punishment was still part of Bulgaria's legal system. However, by the late 1980s, its use had become increasingly rare, particularly in cases involving women. In most instances, death sentences handed down to female defendants were later commuted to life imprisonment. The authority to alter such sentences rested with the State Council. In practice, this body routinely intervened, especially after changes to the penal code in the late 1970s made life imprisonment an available alternative. For years, this process had followed a predictable pattern. Elina's case did not. Despite the usual procedures, no intervention was made. The sentence remained in place. There was no public explanation, no formal statement, and no record of debate surrounding the decision. The process moved forward without delay. At the time, Bulgaria was experiencing heightened political tension. The government was enforcing its assimilation policies, particularly in regions with large Turkish populations. Kardzhali was one such region. Thousands of people had already been affected by forced name changes, arrests and restrictions. The wider political climate was unstable, and state authority was being applied with increasing rigidity. In other cases involving similar crimes, execution had not been carried out. In this instance it was. Why the sentence was allowed to stand was never officially clarified. The decision marked a departure from precedent, and it would have lasting significance beyond the case itself. Following her arrest, formal charges were brought against Elina in connection with the deaths of her two children. The case moved quickly into the judicial system, where it was handled according to standard criminal procedure. Her legal defense entered a plea based on mental incapacity. In response, the court ordered a full psychiatric evaluation. The examination was conducted by state-appointed specialists, whose task was to determine whether she had been aware of her actions at the time of the offense and whether she was fit to stand trial. The assessment concluded that she was mentally competent. She was found to have understood her actions and their consequences. No condition was identified that would exempt her from criminal responsibility. During the proceedings, she did not contest the facts of the case. Responsibility for the deaths was acknowledged. There was no attempt to shift blame or dispute the findings presented by investigators. Her statements to the court reflected acceptance rather than denial. With the psychiatric evaluation complete and the facts uncontested, the trial moved toward its conclusion. There were no procedural delays and no unresolved questions of responsibility. The verdict was delivered shortly thereafter. Elina was found guilty of murder. The sentence was then announced. Following the confirmation of her sentence, Elina was transferred to Sliven prison. At the time, it was the only facility in Bulgaria designated to hold female inmates serving the most severe sentences. Responsibility for carrying out executions rested with the prison administration and the district prosecutor. The execution was scheduled for the early hours of the morning. As was customary, no public notice was given. There were no witnesses, and no announcement was made before or after the event. Elina was removed from her cell and transported by vehicle to a location outside the prison grounds. The site had been prepared in advance. A pit had already been dug in a nearby cemetery. The procedure was conducted without ceremony or formal record. The method used was a single gunshot to the back of the head. The shot was carried out by a volunteer from the prison staff. No further details were officially documented. The body was buried at the site. The execution took place on March about in Bulgaria. That date was observed as International Women's Day. It was also recognized as Mother's Day, a widely marked public occasion. Despite this, the execution proceeded as scheduled. No public statement was issued. No explanation was provided. The process concluded without acknowledgement, and the case was formally closed. In the months that followed the execution, life in Kardzhali continued largely without public acknowledgement of what had taken place. The case was not discussed in official records, and no statement was issued by state authorities. Within the apartment where the events had occurred, change came quietly. Elina's husband later returned to the residence. He did not remain there alone. He eventually remarried, and in the years that followed, he left Bulgaria altogether. He relocated to Turkey, where he lived with his new family. No further public record connects him to the case. In 1989, the Bulgarian government opened its borders to Turkey for a brief period. The decision led to what became known as the Grand Excursion, during which approximately 360,000 Bulgarian Turks left the country. Many did so under pressure, facing job losses, forced relocations, or the seizure of property. The movement marked one of the largest population displacements in modern Bulgarian history. Later that same year, the communist government collapsed. Political reforms followed, and in 1998, the death penalty was formally abolished in Bulgaria. Nearly a decade later, in 2007, the country became a member of the European Union. By that time, Elina Zlatanova's name had largely faded from public memory. Officially, her case remained a matter of record rather than discussion. She is recognized today as the last woman to be executed in Bulgaria. No further statement was issued. No conclusion was offered. The record simply ends there.